Okay, wonderful. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this Future of Good conversation with Petra Molnar, a lawyer and anthropologist specializing in migration, technology, and human rights. Petra is the Associate Director of the Refugee Law Lab at York University here in Toronto and co-runs the Migration and Technology Monitor, which is an archive of experiences of those who encounter surveillance and AI tech at borders and in conflict zones. Petra has traveled super extensively for her research through Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, at the US-Mexico border, and throughout Europe. In her latest book, which came out early this month, I believe, The Walls Have Eyes, she charts the rise of so-called migration management technologies at national borders. She charts how they work and the private and governmental interests that are keeping them in place. Many of these technologies, of course, remain hidden behind NDAs and IP law and competition law, and the algorithms behind many of them are increasingly becoming complex and hard to decipher as well. But it's really the vulnerable communities that are fleeing persecution and fleeing violence that often end up as the guinea pigs in this technology, which is what Petra has come across in her research. People on the move have been historically and continue to be treated as expendable and less than human, she writes. And it's precisely for this reason that all of this experimentation occurs in a space that is largely unregulated, with weak oversight and governance mechanisms, driven by the private sector's pursuit of profit through innovation. So today we're going to chat a little bit more about Petra's research at these border zones, where she interacted extensively with refugees and asylum seekers, volunteers, and NGO staff working in humanitarian aid, and of course came face to face with some of these technologies making decisions about people's futures. So Petra, thank you so much for being with us here today. I'm going to start by asking you what I promise is an easy question to begin with. Can you tell us a little bit more about what led you to researching in this space? What was it about your work in law and in anthropology that led you to exploring technology in migration contexts?
Thanks so much, Sharlene, for having me. It's a real pleasure to be able to reflect on these years of work, really, that has led me to this place. But I always like to start off by saying that I am not a technologist or a tech person by training or even by interest. Like 6 years ago, I barely knew what an algorithm was. Like we're talking like Wikipedia level knowledge. But I was working as a refugee lawyer and an anthropologist on human rights issues and violence against women and immigration detention and issues like that. And then as a result, honestly, of pure chance, started looking at the interplay between technology and migration when partnering up with an amazing group in Canada called the Citizen Lab. We ended up writing a report in 2018 called Bots at the Gate, which was one of the first, if not the first report, analyzing automated decision-making, things like algorithms, machine learning, and different types of projects making their way into immigration from a human rights perspective. And honestly, no one was more surprised than me at how much attention this little report got. And it really kind of catapulted me into this other area of trying to understand migration technology from a global perspective. And over the years, as I was working on this, I really think comparison can be very, very helpful. And trying to compare the Canadian situation with Europe and with the US-Mexico border and other parts of the world that I've also worked in, for me, was paramount to try and stitch together this global story. And as you so nicely outlined in the introduction, for me, it's always motivated by the people who are impacted by this, the people on the move who are crossing borders and interacting with the sharp edges of the technology, but also those who show up and help and who are living in border zones and are impacted by the surveillance. So the book is an attempt to pull together these years of work and research, but also really to always remind us that there are humans who are at the center of this.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. Let's touch on that people element a little bit more there. And especially, in this current context of the proliferation of AI across the board, not just in these contexts, but of course in consumer products, in enterprise settings, there is that renewed discussion of human rights, of a right to privacy, of a right to disappear from the internet, of a right to have a say in how technology is developed, and a right in the policy that governs that technology as well. Something that is a theme that runs through The Walls Have Eyes is the fact that people on the move do not seem to have access to these fundamental human rights and are often at the forefront of experimentation when it comes to technology. You obviously center the communities a lot in your work. And when you were speaking to folks as you were researching, what were folks feeling about these technologies that they had to encounter on their journeys, that they didn't have an option to sideline, to step around? They had to go through these technologies, these data collection mechanisms to get where they needed to be, which is at the end of the day a safe space.
Yeah, I mean, I think this question really nicely highlights the kind of difference between rights on paper and rights in practice. And this is also maybe where my reluctance to be a lawyer kind of comes in. I'm a lawyer, but I'm a reluctant one.
Yeah.
Because, I think there's such a big difference between the fact that we have a right to privacy, we have a right to seek asylum, but then the way that these issues play out on the ground is very, very different. And what you're touching on around informed consent, I think is very pertinent to talk about here. The fact that much of this technology occurs in spaces where there's a huge power differential between the actors who are developing and deploying the technology, whether that's a private actor or a state actor or an international organization that's involved in humanitarian emergencies or border work, and then the community on whom this technology is applied and in some instances tested, right? And a specific example of biometric technology comes to mind where many projects like iris scanning or fingerprinting are making their way into refugee camps. And often it is done under the guise of efficiency and streamlining services, all things that sound good, right? But then when you actually talk to people who are on the receiving end of this tech, some really troubling themes emerge. People that I've spoken with reflect on feeling really dehumanized, kind of being reduced to a fingerprint or an eye scan in a system that's already predicated on huge power differentials, right? And then back to the informed consent bit, it's very different than, for example, you and I or listeners going to our grocery store in Toronto or London or Brussels or Nairobi and being faced with biometrics and being like, I don't want to deal with this. Imagine if that happens in a refugee camp, right? Can you actually meaningfully say no? Or is it about, having to make a really complicated choice between having your irises scanned or not eating that week? That is not true in informed consent. And the fact that these technologies are being rolled out at such a speed without actually having conversations with affected communities about how they feel, do their rights feel protected? Should we be drawing some red lines or bans on some of these technologies? It's just moving at such a speed that I feel like we're playing catch up with a lot of these technologies that are proliferating every day.
Absolutely. And this, I guess, is where folks in the humanitarian aid sector come in, right? I think a large part of your book focuses on private sector actors who are profiteering off of border technologies. But of course, there is an element that the aid sector and NGOs are playing as well. What in your research did you find were the roles that folks were playing when it comes to that NGO sector? And to what extent were they using these technologies, and in what contexts?
Yeah, I mean, paying attention to the NGO sector is super important because it's a major player in this kind of global ecosystem of how technologies are developed and deployed and even normalized, right? I would say the majority of my work focuses on either private actors or states, but always with an eye to other entities too, whether it's the UN, High Commissioner for Refugees, or the International Organization of Migration, the big international organizations, or also smaller players. And one kind of theme that I've noticed is I think we need more critique around the way that technologies are playing out in the humanitarian space, rather than a lean towards what some people call techno-solutionism. So applying technical solutions to really complicated problems. How many times have we seen AI for good or tech for good, tech humanitarianism? But good for who, right? Who gets to determine what we innovate on and why? And I think this is where the kind of industrial complex idea really plays into this as well, because there's massive amounts of money being poured into technologies for border enforcement, for humanitarianism, biometrics in refugee camps. I mean, let's think about where this money would be better spent than on some of these tools, right? Tools that we know can be actually infringing on people's human rights, whether it's the right to privacy, informed consent, discrimination, in some of the more surveillance type technologies, even possibly loss of life. We're really talking about a set of technologies that needs to be interrogated from these more critical perspectives, I think.
It's interesting that you bring up the AI for good point. It was literally something that I was reflecting on a couple of weeks ago, and I thought, well, if that's a specific sliver of AI technologies overall, what are the rest of them doing? And do we need to more critically look at what is not classified in that AI for good? And why not? You know, what's in it? What's in those technologies that we need to pay close attention to? And equally, as you say, good for who? Who gets to determine what is good and what is ethical? But on that similar conversation thread of NGOs and humanitarian aid organizations who were often giving out life-saving items or help or services, be that shelter or food or access to water or sanitation. Did you get the sense that in these critical spaces, be those refugee camps or active borders, that technology was becoming increasingly critical to actually accessing safety and accessing aid? You know, whether that was somebody having access to a personal device or a smartphone, or just complying with the technology that was present at those borders.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it makes me think about kind of two things. Maybe it's a bit of a two-parter. I do think that the kind of normalization of technology and data collection, maybe let's focus on the data collection bit. That to me is very problematic because it seems to be indiscriminate. There's not a lot of safeguards. Oftentimes the public or researchers or journalists don't even know what's happening or why, and big mistakes can be made. You know, I'm thinking specifically around a particular issue that happened a few years ago, where the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, collected a bunch of super sensitive information from Rohingya refugees who were sheltering in Bangladesh, and then inadvertently shared this personal data with Myanmar, the government that the refugees were fleeing from. How can something like this happen? Do we not have sufficient human rights impact assessments and data impact assessments in place to prevent something like this? But I think your question is also getting at the fact that technology is part of our life, right? I mean, smartphones are a lifeline to many people on the move. And that's something that I saw again and again across context after context. What's one of the first things that people want to do? They want to call their loved ones. And so you need access to a phone, the internet, power supply, you know, and things like that. There are global conversations being had about a right to internet or the right to connectivity, right? Because so much of our life now is happening in online spaces. And a lot of that also then has to do about knowledge sharing and information sharing. That's very important. Again, in spaces where there's a vast power differential between people who are maybe seeking asylum and those who are you know, involved in state processes around that. So access to information can be extremely helpful. So there's kind of two parts to this, I think, that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to circle back to that UN example, it's so shocking that that would happen and there wasn't adequate stages of due diligence that happened in the background to stop that from happening. And it just makes you think, well, you would obviously think that the UNHCR in that context would inspire some sense of trust to people who were in a vulnerable situation. And then for that to happen, and for people's vulnerable data to be in the hands of the very government that is persecuting them, just makes you think, of course, there's a lack of trust now in these large intergovernmental organizations. So it's incredibly shocking. But it leads me onto another question about reimagining what these technologies and what these data collection processes look like. I think for me now, it's very obvious that the two are hard to kind of separate. They're two very interlinked things, particularly in the world of AI, where these models are trained on extensive amounts of data. So what has to happen that is new to reimagine, to make sure we are carrying out that due diligence? And and to have the right people in place at every single step of the way, because this isn't just the NGOs acting alone. I mean, the UNHCR example is a very good example of that. That's an NGO plus a government plus the private sector probably all acting together. It's complex. So where do we begin to dismantle, to audit, to rebuild?
And to reimagine,
Yeah.
I mean, it ultimately for me, you know, technology is a lens through which to understand power and how power operates in our world, and who gets to, again, innovate and why. Like, what kind of priorities matter? We have to ask these bigger questions because there's a reason why we're developing tools like biometrics, robo-dogs at the border, AI lie detectors, all of these projects that I cover in the book, you know, and not using AI to audit racist decision-making at the border, right? That's a choice. That's a clear normative choice that a powerful set of actors is making. And so we have to really critically examine who is around the table when we make decisions about tech. Should we maybe build different tables altogether, right? And to me, it ultimately comes down to centering the experiences and the expertise of affected communities and people on the move. That's something that we try and do at one of the projects I run, the Migration and Technology Monitor, where we work directly with colleagues on the move to tell their own stories on border and technology. And so much of that has been really inspirational to me as someone who looks at really like the sharp, dark edges of this, looking at the other side and actually seeing we can meaningfully redistribute resources and seed space and find ways to work together in a different way. And, you know, we run this fellowship program where we incubate projects directly from the ground. And it's been really fascinating because some of the projects look at surveillance and, again, the difficulties of technology, but others look at the promises as well. You know, if I can single out one project, my colleague Simon Drotti, who is a data analyst and also a refugee living in Uganda, he's been working on a psychosocial digital archive called the Memory Scroll for his own community to act as a memory-making device for people on the move. To me, that's such an evocative way and a really creative way to reimagine what can happen in spaces of migration. But again, it's about giving people access to resources and tools, and then also making space and stepping back and seeing how things kind of play out. That to me is about remaking the world in a different image and allowing us to think beyond the kind of paradigm that we are stuck in.
Yeah, I think that's such a lovely note to end on, which is, what do we hold as data that is valid and important, and how does lived experience and that qualitative emotional aspect feed into that? You know, do we consider that valid data? And if we don't, why don't we? So that was wonderful. Petra, thank you so much for your time. That was absolutely phenomenal. And if folks haven't read The Walls Have Eyes, please do go and have a read. It's a fantastic, fantastic book. Petra, thank you so much.